I signed my name because I believed doing the right thing would protect me. It was a Tuesday morning, just after 9, and the conference room smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. Halfway through the meeting, my supervisor slid a folder across the table and asked me to explain numbers I had never seen before. No one looked at me. Someone quietly locked the door. On the screen behind them, my employee ID number was already highlighted. That was the moment I realized everything I trusted was about to turn against me. I signed my name because I believed that doing the right thing would protect me. That is what I had been taught my entire life. Follow the rules. Document everything. Be honest, even when it is inconvenient. On that Tuesday morning, just after 9, I sat in a glass-walled conference room in downtown Minneapolis with a pen in my hand and no reason to feel afraid. The room was ordinary in a way that felt comforting. A long laminate table, 12 gray chairs, only 8 of them filled. A wall-mounted screen humming softly. The smell of burnt coffee drifting in from the break area down the hall. Someone had left a half-empty box of glazed donuts near the window, the cardboard lid folded back like an afterthought. I remember noticing a coffee stain on my sleeve and making a mental note to deal with it later. This was supposed to be a routine internal review. I had been through dozens of them in my career. I worked as a compliance manager for a mid-sized healthcare logistics company, the kind of job no one notices unless something goes wrong. My responsibility was to make sure contracts were clean, billing followed federal guidelines, and nothing triggered an audit from Medicare or the state. It was boring work, precise work, the kind of work you do well so you can sleep at night. I had prepared my notes the night before, printed copies, highlighted sections, sticky tabs placed with care. I arrived early, like I always did, and plugged my laptop into the conference room dock myself because the IT guy was running late. When my supervisor, Grant, walked in, he nodded at me the way he always did, polite, neutral. Nothing in his face warned me that my life was about to split into a before and an after. The meeting started on time. Grant stood at the head of the table, remote in hand, flipping through slides that looked exactly like every other quarterly review we had ever done. Vendor summaries, delivery timelines, reimbursement projections. People took notes, someone coughed, someone else checked their watch. I remember thinking about what I would make for dinner and whether I had time to stop at the grocery store after work. About 20 minutes in, Grant paused on a slide I did not recognize. It was a spreadsheet, rows of numbers, client IDs, dates, reimbursement codes. My stomach tightened slightly, the way it does when you see something unfamiliar in a place that should feel controlled. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen, already trying to make sense of it. These figures, Grant said, his voice calm, almost casual, were pulled during a secondary review last week. I waited for him to continue. He did not look at me. He did not look at anyone in particular. He just clicked the remote, enlarging one section of the spreadsheet. We noticed some inconsistencies, he said. Inconsistencies. The word landed softly, but it carried weight. In my line of work, inconsistencies were never small. They were the cracks that inspectors pried open, the kind of thing that got people fired. Or worse. Grant finally turned toward me then. He slid a thin folder across the table, the cardboard scraping faintly against the surface. "Can you walk us through these numbers?" he asked. I opened the folder. Inside were printed reports I had never seen before. Not drafts, not versions I recognized. My name was on the header. My employee ID number sat neatly in the top right corner. The formatting matched our internal templates perfectly. My first thought was that there had been a mistake. "I'm sorry," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I don't recognize these reports." No one responded. I looked around the table, expecting confusion, questions, anything. Instead, people avoided my eyes. One woman suddenly found her notebook fascinating. Another adjusted the cuff of his shirt. Someone at the far end of the table slowly closed their laptop, the soft click sounding louder than it should have. Grant did not correct me. He did not say, "Oh, that is strange." He did not say, "Let's clarify." He just nodded once. "That's what we need to understand," he said. The air in the room shifted. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It was subtle, like the pressure change before a storm. I felt it in my chest before I could explain it in words. I flipped through the pages, line after line of data, billing entries that looked valid at first glance but did not align with our actual delivery records, adjustments made on dates I had been on approved leave, authorizations I had never signed. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "These codes wouldn't clear without secondary approval." Grant leaned back in his chair. "They did clear," he said. "That's the problem." Tonight minus. I opened my mouth to respond, then stopped. Something about his tone felt off. Not accusatory. Worse, final. I glanced at the screen again. That was when I noticed the detail that would not leave my mind later. In the bottom corner of the slide, small and easy to miss, was my employee ID number, highlighted in pale yellow, like someone had wanted to make sure it stood out without drawing attention to the act of highlighting itself. No one said my name. Not once. They talked about the role, about process failures, about responsibility alignment. Every sentence was carefully constructed to avoid saying what everyone in that room was thinking. I felt heat rise in my face, but I kept my hands still on the table. Years of compliance work had trained me to stay composed under pressure. Panic never helped. Facts did. "There should be system logs," I said. "Access records, timestamps. If these changes were made under my credentials, there would be a trail." Grant nodded again, too quickly. "We've secured the system," he said. "IT is reviewing access logs now." Secured. Reviewing. The words sounded reasonable, but something inside me recoiled. Those actions should have happened after my input, not before. I heard a faint click behind me. I turned my head slightly. The conference room door had been closed. That, by itself, was not unusual. Meetings were often closed for privacy, but I could have sworn it had been open earlier. I watched, almost detached, as the metal latch settled into place. No one acknowledged it. Grant cleared his throat. "For the record," he said, "this review is now considered formal." Formal. My pulse quickened, just a little. I was still calm, still professional, but my body was beginning to understand something my mind had not fully accepted yet. "This affects my professional standing," I said. "I'd like to have legal representation present if—" Grant raised his hand gently, the way someone does when calming a child. "There's no need to escalate," he said. "We're just trying to establish clarity." Clarity. Another soft word, another warning disguised as reassurance. He gestured toward the screen again. "If you could explain how these entries occurred," he said, "we can move forward." I stared at the numbers, at the dates, at my ID. I realized then that this meeting was not about finding the truth. It was about watching me react. Every option in front of me felt wrong. If I defended myself too aggressively, I would look guilty. If I stayed quiet, I would look complicit. The room had been arranged, carefully and deliberately, to leave me no safe position. I took a breath. "I can't explain data I didn't create," I said, "but I can prove that." The word prove hung in the air. For the first time, Grant's expression flickered. Just for a second, something like irritation, or maybe disappointment. "We'll see," he said. The meeting continued for another 15 minutes, though time lost its usual shape. They asked questions that circled the same point without ever touching it. I answered carefully, documenting every word in my mind. When Grant finally adjourned the meeting, no one lingered to make small talk. People stood, gathered their things, and left in silence. As I packed my laptop, I noticed my hands were shaking. In the hallway, my phone buzzed. A calendar notification had been added without my input. Mandatory follow-up, HR present, tomorrow at 8 a.m. As I walked back to my desk, I passed the break room. The box of donuts was gone. The coffee pot had been emptied and left unwashed in the sink. Everything looked the same. But I knew, with a clarity that settled deep in my bones, that the version of my life where doing the right thing protected me had just ended. And whatever this was, it had been set in motion long before I walked into that room. Before that Tuesday, my life had been predictable in a way I took pride in. I lived alone in a modest townhouse on the south side of Minneapolis, close enough to downtown that my commute stayed under 30 minutes, far enough that the streets were quiet at night. The house was nothing special: beige siding, a narrow garage, a patch of grass I pretended I would eventually landscape, but it was mine. I had signed the mortgage on my own, after years of careful saving and an even longer stretch of telling myself to wait until I was more stable. The day the keys landed in my palm, I cried in my car for 5 full minutes before driving away. Stability mattered to me. It always had. I grew up in a family where money was discussed in hushed tones and mistakes were remembered for years. My father worked construction until his knees gave out. My mother balanced 2 part-time jobs and still found time to remind my sister and me that reputation was a form of currency. "Once you lose people's trust," she would say, "you never really get it back." I believed her. That belief followed me into adulthood, into college, into my career. I did not chase flashy titles or risky promotions. I chose compliance because it was solid, because it was necessary, because it rewarded people who paid attention to details others ignored. I learned federal regulations the way some people learned recipes, memorizing the order, the exceptions, the footnotes no one else bothered to read. At work, I was known as reliable. The person you copied on an email when you wanted something done right. The one who stayed late to double-check a contract, not because anyone asked, but because it felt wrong to leave uncertainty behind. I brought my lunch from home. I kept my desk tidy. I never missed a deadline. When the company restructured 3 years ago, I survived the layoffs. When new management came in, they kept me. Grant had been my supervisor for just under 2 years. We were not friends, but we were cordial. He trusted my work, or at least, I thought he did. Outside of work, my life was quiet. I met friends for dinner once or twice a week. We rotated through the same handful of restaurants, complained about parking, laughed about things that felt small and safe. On weekends, I ran errands, cleaned the house, called my parents. Sometimes I drove out to one of the lakes and walked the path until my thoughts settled into something manageable. There was no chaos, no drama, no reason to think my life could unravel overnight. Looking back now, I can see the hairline fractures, the moments that should have made me pause, but at the time, they felt like nothing. 6 months earlier, Grant had asked me to, temporarily, take on oversight of a new vendor relationship. It was outside my usual scope, but not by much. The vendor handled last-mile medical deliveries for rural clinics, time-sensitive, regulated. Exactly the kind of thing compliance existed to monitor. "It's just until we get someone else trained," Grant had said, standing by my desk with his coffee. "You're the best fit." I agreed without hesitation. Being the best fit had become part of my identity. The workload increased, but I managed it the way I managed everything else. I built spreadsheets, set reminders, documented approvals. When I noticed minor discrepancies early on, I flagged them, sent emails, followed up. Most were explained away quickly. A delayed scan here, a clerical error there. Nothing that suggested fraud. Nothing that suggested intent. There were a few odd moments, though, small enough to ignore. Like the time I received a confirmation email for a billing adjustment I had not requested. I replied, asking for clarification, and was told it had been resolved upstream. The phrase bothered me. Vague answers always did. But the adjustment was reversed, and I moved on. Another time, I logged into the system after a long weekend and noticed my password had been reset. IT apologized, claimed there had been a routine update. I changed it again and wrote it off as inconvenience. Each incident, by itself, was forgettable. Together, they formed a pattern I did not yet know how to see. At home, my routines continued unchanged. I watered the plants, paid the bills, watched the news while folding laundry. I slept well. I believed, deeply, that I had earned my sense of security. That belief made what came next so disorienting. After the meeting on Tuesday, I tried to return to normal. I answered emails, reviewed contracts, took notes during calls, but everything felt slightly off, like the office had shifted a few inches to the left and no one acknowledged it. People spoke to me carefully. Too carefully. Conversations stopped when I walked into the break room. A colleague I had worked with for years smiled at me with a tightness around her eyes that had not been there before. By mid-afternoon, my access to one of the internal dashboards was gone. I stared at the error message on my screen, my cursor hovering uselessly over the refresh button. I had not been notified of any changes. No explanation, just a quiet denial. I emailed IT, polite, neutral, asked if there had been an outage. The reply came back 15 minutes later. Access restrictions are temporary. Management directive. That was it. No signature. No timeline. I closed my laptop and sat back in my chair, listening to the hum of the office. Phones ringing. Printers whirring. Life continuing, indifferent to the way my chest felt tight, as if something heavy had settled there without permission. On the drive home, traffic crawled. Red brake lights stretched endlessly ahead of me. I turned the radio off and drove in silence, replaying the meeting in my mind. Grant's tone, the way no one said my name, the highlighted employee ID. At home, I dropped my bag by the door and stood in the kitchen, staring at the counter. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. I had wiped everything down that morning before leaving, a habit I had picked up during the pandemic and never quite let go. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it too fast, feeling it slosh uncomfortably in my stomach. For the first time that day, I allowed myself to think the thought I had been avoiding. What if this was not a misunderstanding? The idea felt almost disloyal, as if questioning the system that had rewarded me for years was a kind of betrayal. I pushed it aside and focused on practicalities instead. The HR meeting tomorrow, the need to gather my documentation, the importance of staying calm. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and logged into my personal email. I forwarded myself copies of reports I still had access to, downloaded old approvals, cross-referenced dates. I worked for hours, chasing a sense of control that kept slipping through my fingers. Around 10, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "Everything okay? You sounded tired earlier." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. For a moment, I considered telling her everything, the meeting, the implications. The fear coiled just beneath my ribs. Instead, I typed, "Just a long day. All good." She replied with a heart emoji and a reminder to get some rest. I closed the laptop and went upstairs, moving through the house on autopilot, brushed my teeth, changed into pajamas, set my alarm. In bed, the dark felt heavier than usual. My mind refused to settle, cycling through worst-case scenarios I had never allowed myself to consider before. Job loss, legal trouble, public embarrassment, the erosion of the very reputation I had spent my life protecting. Somewhere between midnight and morning, I finally slept. When I woke up, the feeling was still there. Not panic. Not yet. Just the quiet certainty that the life I trusted, the one built on rules and good intentions, was standing on ground far less solid than I had ever believed. And whatever had started with that meeting was not going to end quickly or cleanly. The email arrived at 7:42 a.m., 12 minutes before I pulled into the parking garage. I noticed it only because my phone vibrated twice in quick succession while I was waiting for the gate arm to lift. One vibration would not have caught my attention. Two felt deliberate. I glanced down, expecting a calendar reminder for the HR meeting. Instead, I saw the subject line, "Notice of external review. Immediate cooperation required." My stomach tightened. I did not open it right away. I put the phone face down in the cup holder and drove into the garage, the concrete levels blurring past as I spiraled upward. I parked in my usual spot on level 4, backed in carefully, and turned the engine off. For a few seconds, I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking sound of cooling metal. Then I opened the email. It was short. Too short for what it implied. The message informed me that, due to recent findings, an external review had been initiated. A third-party auditing firm had been engaged. I was instructed to preserve all records, refrain from deleting or modifying any files, and make myself available for questioning if requested. At the bottom, in smaller text, was a line that made my throat go dry. "This notice is not an accusation. Non-compliance, however, may be interpreted accordingly. I read the email twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the meaning. It did not. The language was careful, legal, designed to sound neutral while boxing me into a corner. External review. That meant this had already moved beyond internal politics, beyond misunderstandings, beyond the possibility of someone realizing a mistake had been made and quietly fixing it. I locked my car and walked toward the elevator, my badge swinging lightly from its clip. The garage smelled like oil and damp concrete. My footsteps echoed in a way that made the space feel larger, emptier. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. My face looked normal, pale, maybe, but composed. If I passed anyone in the hallway, they would see the same woman who came in every morning, coffee in hand, ready to work. I stepped onto my floor and immediately sensed the difference. The front desk assistant smiled at me, but it was the kind of smile people use when they are bracing themselves. Her eyes flicked briefly to her screen, then back to my face. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," I replied. As I walked toward my desk, I noticed that two people from IT were standing near the server room, speaking in low voices. One of them glanced up when I passed, then looked away quickly. At my desk, my computer was already on. That stopped me short. I always powered it down at night. Always. It was a small habit, but one I kept religiously. Seeing the screen glowing faintly in the dim morning light sent a cold ripple through me. I set my bag down slowly and touched the mouse. The login screen appeared. Normal. Nothing to indicate what had been done or accessed. I logged in. Several folders on my shared drive were grayed out. I clicked one. Access denied. Another. Same message. I exhaled through my nose, forcing myself to stay calm. This was procedural, I told myself. Standard protocol during a review. They were protecting data, protecting the company, protecting themselves. At 8 sharp, my calendar reminder chimed. HR meeting, conference room B. I grabbed my notebook and stood, smoothing my blazer as if the gesture could smooth the tension coiled inside me. The walk to conference room B felt longer than usual. Every step measured, my senses tuned too sharply to the sounds around me. The room was smaller than the one from the day before. No glass walls this time. Just beige paint, a rectangular table, and a single narrow window that looked out onto the brick wall of the neighboring building. Grant was already there. So was Linda from HR. And a man I did not recognize. He stood when I entered, extending his hand. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Daniel Price. I'm with North Star Audit Services." The room tilted, just slightly. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, professional, his expression neutral in the way people learn to perfect when their job involves other people's crises. We sat. Linda began with practiced efficiency, outlining the purpose of the meeting, my rights, the company's obligations. Her voice was calm, almost soothing, as if she were explaining benefits enrollment instead of the slow dismantling of my career. Daniel listened, hands folded, eyes attentive. Then the questions started. They were not aggressive. That was the most unsettling part. Daniel did not accuse. He asked, gently, methodically, "Can you describe your role in overseeing vendor compliance? How often did you personally authorize billing adjustments? Were there any circumstances under which your credentials would be used by someone else?" Each question felt reasonable, answerable. I responded clearly, honestly, referencing policies, dates, procedures. Grant sat quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally interjecting to clarify a timeline. He did not defend me. He did not contradict me either. He simply added context where it suited him. About halfway through, Daniel pulled out a tablet and turned it toward me. "Do you recognize this interface?" he asked. It was a screenshot of our internal system. "Yes," I said. "That's our billing authorization panel. And this user activity log?" he continued, swiping to the next image. My breath caught. The log showed a series of entries made under my credentials. Late at night, early morning hours, times when I knew I had been asleep. "I didn't make those entries," I said. "I can provide proof of my schedule, travel records, Badge access logs. Anything you need, Daniel nodded, as if he expected that answer. We'll be requesting those, he said. Linda glanced at Grant. Given the scope of the review, she said carefully, we've placed you on administrative leave, effective immediately. The words landed with a dull thud. Paid leave, she added quickly. This is not disciplinary. It's standard during an external audit. Administrative leave. I had heard the phrase used for other people. Colleagues whose desks were quietly cleared while everyone pretended not to notice. People who said they would be back in a week and never were. When does it end? I asked. Linda hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. That depends on the findings, she said. The meeting wrapped up soon after. More instructions, more assurances, more language designed to sound fair while offering no real protection. When I stood to leave, Daniel gave me a polite nod. If you think of anything else, he said, any details that might help clarify the situation, please reach out. Clarify. As if the truth were simply misplaced, waiting to be found. I walked back to my desk under Linda's supervision. She stood nearby while I collected personal items. A mug, a framed photo of my sister and me at the lake, a small potted plant I had kept alive longer than any other. No one spoke to me. I felt their eyes anyway. In the elevator down to the garage, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was not work. It was a notification from my bank. Unusual activity detected. Please review recent changes to your account. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. When I opened the app, my stomach dropped. A new authorized user had been added to one of my accounts. I did not recognize the name. The timestamp showed it had been done 2 days earlier, during work hours, while I had been sitting at my desk, doing the job I believed was protecting me. In that moment, standing alone in a silent elevator, it finally became clear. This was not one mistake. It was not one bad meeting. It was not even one betrayal. It was a series of decisions, made quietly, carefully, by people who understood exactly how systems worked and how much damage could be done before anyone noticed. And somehow, without my consent, without my knowledge, my life had been positioned as the point of failure. As I stepped out into the garage and walked toward my car, one thought repeated itself with unsettling clarity. Whatever this was, it had started long before Tuesday, and it was designed so that, by the time I saw it, I would already be standing in the wrong place. Administrative leave is supposed to feel like a pause. That is how HR describes it. A temporary measure, a neutral step, time to let facts surface without pressure. In reality, it feels more like being pushed out of a moving train and told to wait on the tracks while everyone else keeps going. The first morning after I was sent home, I woke up at my usual time out of habit, 6:15. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually feels peaceful. That morning, it felt accusatory, like the walls were watching me do nothing while my life unraveled somewhere else. I made coffee anyway. Same mug, same routine. I stood at the kitchen counter, scrolling through my phone, half expecting another email from work, some clarification, some apology, some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. Nothing came. Instead, there was a voicemail from my bank's fraud department, time-stamped 30 minutes earlier. Polite, professional, asking me to confirm recent account changes. I called back immediately. After the usual verification questions, the representative read the name of the newly authorized user again. Hearing it out loud made my skin prickle. I didn't add anyone, I said. I don't know who that is. There was a pause on the line, the sound of typing. The authorization was completed in person, she said, at a branch downtown. My heart skipped. In person? I repeated. That's not possible. I was at work. She asked me to hold. When she came back, her tone had shifted slightly, no longer neutral. I'm going to flag this for investigation, she said. We'll temporarily freeze the account. You may want to review any other financial profiles you have. I thanked her, hung up, and sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Downtown, the same area as my office. The same area where I had walked into a conference room believing I was safe. For the first time since this started, anger flared hot and sharp beneath the fear. Not panic, not confusion. Anger at the precision of it all. the timing, the way every piece fit together too cleanly to be accidental. I spent the rest of the morning doing what I had been trained to do for years. I reviewed every account, every password, every login history I could access. Most things were untouched. A few showed subtle anomalies, password reset attempts, verification emails I had dismissed without much thought weeks earlier. Each one, on its own, had seemed minor. Now they formed a map. By early afternoon, my phone rang. Grant's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment before answering. "Hello," I said. "Just checking in," he said, his voice warm, almost friendly. "I wanted to see how you're holding up." The question was so ordinary it nearly made me laugh. "I'm managing," I said. "I had a question about the audit process." "Of course," he replied smoothly. "What's on your mind?" "The system access," I said. "Who authorized the changes before the review began?" There was a brief pause. Not long enough to be suspicious on its own, just long enough to register. "That would have come from senior management," he said. "Standard protocol." "Which senior manager?" I asked. Another pause. "These things are handled at a level above day-to-day operations," he said. "I wouldn't worry about it." That was the moment something shifted inside me. Grant had always been careful with language, precise. When he said he wouldn't worry about it, what he meant was that he did not want me looking any closer. "I also received a notice from my bank," I said. "Someone added an authorized user to my account downtown, during work hours." His response came too quickly. "That's unfortunate," he said, "but I'm sure it's unrelated." Unrelated. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying my breath. "Grant," I said, "has anyone else had access to my credentials?" He exhaled, a sound meant to convey patience. "Look," he said, "these reviews are stressful. It's easy to connect dots that aren't actually connected. The best thing you can do right now is cooperate and let the process work." There it was. The subtle repositioning. The implication that my concerns were emotional, not rational. "I am cooperating," I said. "That's why I'm asking." I found it. "Well," he replied, his tone cooling slightly, "if you think of anything relevant, let us know." The call ended soon after. I sat in silence, my phone resting face down on the table. That was when I understood something I had been resisting since the meeting. Grant was not confused. He was not surprised. He was not caught off guard by any of this. He had been standing in the right place long before I realized there was a wrong one. Later that evening, my sister called. She lived in Chicago and had a way of sensing when something was off, even before I said a word. "You sound weird," she said after I answered. "What's going on?" I told her a version of the truth. The audit, the leave, the uncertainty. I left out the bank account, the call with Grant, the sense of being deliberately cornered. "That's insane," she said. "You're the most careful person I know." "I thought so too," I replied. She was quiet for a moment. "Is there anyone who benefits from this?" she asked. The question landed harder than I expected. I thought of the vendor oversight I had taken on, the discrepancies I had flagged early, the emails I had sent asking for clarification that never quite came. "There might be," I said slowly. That night, I opened my personal laptop and logged into an old backup drive I had kept out of habit. It contained archived work emails from before our company switched servers. I had never deleted them. Not because I planned to need them, but because I did not like erasing records. I searched my name, hundreds of results. Then I searched the vendor's name. The pattern sharpened. Email chains where concerns were redirected. Requests for documentation that were delayed. Approvals that arrived without explanation. Always from higher up. Always just enough to move things forward. And then there were emails I did not remember sending. Drafts, saved but never sent, time-stamped late at night. Language that sounded like me, but not quite. Too sloppy. Too vague. Things I would never put in writing. My pulse raced as I scrolled. Someone had been using my identity long before the audit. Not just my credentials. My professional voice. The realization made my hands tremble. This was bigger than a scapegoat. Bigger than a single betrayal. It was a structure. A system that relied on my reputation for precision, my habit of compliance, my reluctance to make noise. I had been the perfect shield, the perfect buffer, the person no one would suspect until it was too late. And now, when the risk had grown too large to hide, the shield was being cracked open and displayed as the source of the damage. I closed the laptop slowly. For the first time since this began, fear gave way to something steadier. Clarity. I was no longer trying to convince myself that this was an accident. It was not. And whoever had built this plan had underestimated one thing. They had assumed that once I was isolated, confused, and afraid, I would stop paying attention. They were wrong. Because this was my life they had threaded through their scheme, and I was done being quiet about it. The first thing I lost was not my paycheck. That came later. What disappeared almost immediately was my standing. The invisible structure that had held my life together for years, built out of quiet credibility and unspoken trust, began to erode in ways I could feel but not always see. It started with a voicemail from a former colleague, someone I had worked with closely for nearly 5 years. We had shared deadlines, late nights, inside jokes about broken printers and impossible regulations. Her message was careful. "Hey," she said, "I just wanted to check in. I heard there's a review going on. If you need anything, let me know." She did not say my name after that. She did not ask questions. She did not call back when I returned the voicemail. By the end of the week, my work email access was fully disabled, not just restricted, gone. The automated reply informed senders that I was temporarily unavailable. No timeline, no explanation. Temporary is a flexible word. It stretches easily when no one is accountable for how long it lasts. On Friday afternoon, I received a certified letter from HR, the kind that requires a signature, as if the physical act of accepting it matters more than the content inside. The letter outlined the terms of my administrative leave in precise, impersonal language. I was not to represent the company in any capacity. I was not to contact vendors. I was not to access internal systems. Any violation could be grounds for termination. At the bottom, in bold, was a line that made my throat tighten. This measure is taken to preserve organizational integrity. Organizational integrity. The phrase stung more than any accusation could have. It implied that my presence, my continued involvement, was a threat to something larger and more important than me. I folded the letter and placed it carefully on the kitchen counter, aligning it with the edge the way I always did with paperwork. The habit felt absurd now, but I could not bring myself to abandon it. That weekend, I ran into someone from work at the grocery store. I was in the produce aisle, comparing 2 bags of apples, when I heard my name spoken hesitantly behind me. I turned. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Oh," he said. "Hey, I didn't know if that was you. Du Intelf." "It is," I replied. There was an awkward pause. He glanced at my cart, then back at my face. "So," he said, "how's everything going?" The question was loaded. We both knew it. "I'm taking some time off," I said, sorting through a few things. He nodded, relief flickering across his features at the vague answer. "Yeah," he said, "makes sense." He excused himself a moment later, his cart rolling away faster than necessary. As I stood there, staring at the apples, it hit me how quickly distance forms when doubt enters a space. No one had accused me openly. No one had said I was guilty. But suspicion had a way of hollowing out relationships without making a sound. By Monday, the professional distance had bled into my personal life. A community board I volunteered on sent out an update announcing a temporary change in compliance oversight. My name was not mentioned. It simply stated that responsibilities had been reassigned due to recent developments. Recent developments. The words followed me everywhere, vague and heavy. I considered resigning from the board outright, sparing myself the humiliation of being quietly sidelined, but something in me resisted. Walking away would feel like an admission, even if no one asked for one. Instead, I stayed silent. The hardest moment came unexpectedly, on a Wednesday afternoon. I received a call from a clinic administrator I had worked with for years. She sounded uneasy. "I wanted to hear it from you," she said, "before rumors get out of hand." My chest tightened. "About what?" I asked. She hesitated. There's talk that some deliveries were billed improperly, she said, and that it traces back to your oversight. I closed my eyes. I didn't do that, I said, and I can prove it. I know, she replied quickly. I think I know, but you should be aware that people are talking. Talking. That was how reputations died, not through formal charges or dramatic confrontations, but through quiet conversations that ended with uncertainty instead of clarity. After the call, I sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time, my hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. I felt stripped of something essential. Not my job, not my income, my authority over my own story. Others were telling it now, filling in gaps with speculation, framing events without my input. I had always believed that truth, documented carefully enough, would speak for itself. Watching it be drowned out by implication was a lesson I had never expected to learn. That night, I received an email from the auditing firm, a formal request for documentation. They wanted access logs, personal calendars, travel records, any information that could corroborate my claim that I was not responsible for the flagged activity. The request was reasonable, necessary, but it came with a warning. Failure to provide complete documentation may be noted in the final report. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. They were asking me to prove my innocence while actively cutting off my ability to access the very systems that held that proof. I replied politely, acknowledging the request and asking for clarification on how I was expected to retrieve restricted records. The response came the next day. You may submit any materials in your possession, it read. Company-controlled records will be reviewed internally. Internally. By the same people who had already decided I was a liability. That was when it became painfully clear that this was not just about facts. It was about optics. About creating a narrative where I appeared uncooperative, disorganized, or evasive, regardless of the reality. I was being set up to fail gracefully. At the end of the week, my direct deposit did not arrive. No warning. No explanation. When I called payroll, the representative sounded apologetic but firm. Disbursements are temporarily suspended pending review, she said. HR should have notified you. They had not. I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. I had savings, enough to cover a few months, but the suddenness of it shook me, the way financial pressure crept in quietly, turning fear into something more immediate. That night, I opened my budgeting spreadsheet, the one I had kept updated for years. I adjusted projections, cut discretionary spending, moved numbers around until they made sense again. It was comforting, in a hollow way. But even as I recalculated, I knew the loss I was grieving was not monetary. They had taken my credibility. They had taken my voice in rooms where decisions were being made about my life. They had taken the assumption of good faith I had relied on for years without realizing how fragile it was. And they had done it slowly, methodically, under the cover of policy and procedure. As I closed the spreadsheet and shut down my laptop, one thought settled in with quiet resolve. If they believed I would retreat into silence, wait patiently for fairness to return on its own, they had misunderstood me. I had spent my career protecting systems from abuse. Now, I was learning exactly how those systems could be turned against someone, and I was not finished watching what they took, because I was beginning to understand what I would need to take back. By the time the audit request arrived, I had already stopped hoping for fairness. Hope, I learned quickly, was a luxury reserved for people who still believed the system would correct itself once presented with the right facts. I had crossed that line somewhere between the frozen bank account and the suspended paycheck. What replaced hope was something quieter and far more useful. Attention. I began treating my own life the way I would have treated a failing compliance case, not emotionally, methodically. I made lists, timelines. I wrote things down, not to convince anyone else, but to anchor myself to reality while everything around me blurred. The auditors wanted documentation, so I started there. I pulled out old planners, the physical kind I still used out of habit. I cross-checked meeting notes with calendar entries. I downloaded location history from my phone, not because I had anything to hide, but because I needed to establish where I had been at specific times. I requested badge access logs from building management for my townhouse and saved screenshots of the confirmation emails. It was tedious work, familiar work, the kind that grounded me. Late one evening, while sorting through archived emails on my backup drive, I noticed something I had skimmed past before. It was a forwarded message, buried deep in a thread about vendor delivery timelines. At first glance, it looked unremarkable. Same subject line, same formatting, same signature block I had used for years. But the timestamp was wrong. The email had been sent at 2:14 a.m. I did not work at 2 in the morning. I never had. I was meticulous about boundaries, especially with something as sensitive as compliance approvals. I flagged it and moved on, assuming it was part of the same pattern I had already identified. Then I noticed something else. The signature block was slightly off. Most people would never have caught it. One space too many between my first and last name, a missing comma after my job title. Tiny deviations. The kind you only see when you have stared at your own words long enough to know their shape. I opened another email from the same period. Same issue. Another. Same. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay still. This was important. I could feel it. I opened my sent folder from the company server backup. Compared messages side by side. The differences were subtle but consistent. Whoever had written those emails knew my voice, my cadence, my professional tone. They knew how I structured sentences, how I softened directives, how I framed concerns to sound cooperative rather than confrontational. But they did not know my habits. They did not know that I always included my middle initial in formal correspondence, that I never signed off without a comma, that I saved drafts compulsively and rarely sent anything without rereading it twice. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. Someone had not just used my credentials, they had tried to become me. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with fear. It was something colder, more clarifying. This was no longer about a mistake or even a convenient scapegoat. It was about authorship, about control of narrative. Someone had needed my credibility, my history of clean audits and careful language, to move things forward without drawing attention. And now, that same credibility was being used to bury me. I printed the emails and spread them out on my dining table, arranging them by date. As I did, another detail emerged, one I had missed before. Several of the emails had been sent from my account while I was in meetings. Not just any meetings. Meetings that Grant had scheduled. I pulled up my calendar and matched the times. There it was. Over and over again. Emails sent under my name, during blocks of time when my schedule showed I was in conference rooms, on recorded calls, or presenting materials to leadership. Times when my attention would have been fully occupied. Times when no one would question my absence from my desk. I stared at the pattern until my eyes burned. This was not opportunistic. It was coordinated. I thought back to the morning my password had been reset after the so-called system update, to the times I had logged in and found approvals already cleared, to the vague explanations, the upstream resolutions. It had all been hiding in plain sight. I took photos of everything, screenshots, metadata. I saved copies to 2 separate external drives and uploaded encrypted versions to a secure cloud folder under an alias. Redundancy mattered. If there was one thing this experience had taught me, it was that access could disappear without warning. The next piece fell into place almost by accident. I was reviewing the vendor contract amendments from the past year when I noticed a version number that did not align with our standard workflow. The document had been modified after final approval. That alone was unusual. Amendments required resubmission, reapproval, re-signing. This one had not. I checked the revision history. The change had been made using my credentials. I compared the amendment language to the earlier drafts. It was subtle, a few lines adjusting reimbursement thresholds, language that allowed for expedited billing under exceptional circumstances. The kind of clause that could be exploited if no one was watching closely. The kind of clause I would never have approved without escalation. I felt something close to admiration for the audacity of it. Whoever had done this understood exactly how much could be altered without triggering alarms. They knew where oversight was lightest, where trust was assumed, and they had counted on one thing above all else: that I would never imagine someone inside the system would go this far. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A text from an unknown number. "Hey, just checking in. Hope you're doing okay." No name. New context. I did not respond. Instead, I copied the number and ran it through a basic lookup service. It came back registered to a prepaid phone. No associated name. I added it to my notes. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept circling the same realization, examining it from every angle. The audit was not uncovering wrongdoing. It was sanitizing it. By placing me at the center of the narrative, by freezing my access and isolating me from systems and people, they were buying time. Time to frame events. Time to align stories. Time to make the truth look messy enough to be dismissed as uncertainty. But they had missed something. They had underestimated the habits of someone who had built her life on documentation. By the following afternoon, I had assembled a working timeline that told a very different story from the one being quietly circulated about me. A story that showed deliberate impersonation, strategic timing, and a clear motive to reroute scrutiny away from where it belonged. I did not share it. Not yet. Instead, I sat back and considered my next move. In my old life, the one where I still believed in procedural fairness, I would have sent everything to HR, to the auditors, to anyone who would listen. I would have trusted that evidence, laid out cleanly enough, would force a correction. Now, I understood that timing mattered as much as truth, and that revealing what I knew too soon would only teach them how to adapt. So I did something that felt deeply uncomfortable at first. I stayed quiet. I answered audit requests promptly but narrowly. I provided exactly what was asked for and nothing more. I did not volunteer theories or conclusions. I let them continue under the assumption that I was overwhelmed, defensive, scrambling to catch up. And while they watched me, I watched them back. Because the smallest detail, the one they had overlooked because it seemed insignificant, had already given me something invaluable. Proof that this was intentional. And proof that whoever had done this believed I would never notice the difference between my voice and a convincing imitation of it. They were wrong. And from that moment on, I stopped thinking of myself as someone waiting to be cleared. I started thinking like someone preparing to expose a system that had mistaken her silence for weakness. The hardest part was not staying silent. It was pretending that silence meant defeat. In the weeks that followed my discovery, I learned how much people project onto quiet. How quickly restraint is mistaken for confusion. How easily patience is interpreted as surrender. I let them believe it. I responded to every audit request within the stated deadlines. Not early, not late. Exactly on time. My emails were brief, factual, stripped of emotion. I thanked them for their diligence. I apologized for delays that were not my fault. I asked clarifying questions that made me sound overwhelmed rather than strategic. It felt wrong at first. Every instinct in me wanted to correct the record, to point out the inconsistencies, to defend my name. But instincts are shaped by the world you think you live in, not the one you are actually in. And I was no longer living in a world where fairness arrived on its own. The auditors scheduled interviews, phone calls, mostly. Daniel asked careful questions, the same ones phrased slightly differently each time. He was looking for cracks. Emotional ones, moments where my story wavered. I gave him none. I told the truth, but not all of it. Not yet. At the same time, I began making myself smaller in visible ways. I stopped attending industry webinars under my real name. I removed my LinkedIn profile photo and changed my headline to something vague. I declined invitations to professional mixers with polite excuses. I did not want to be remembered as present, confident, or defiant. I wanted to be forgettable. Grant stopped calling. That, more than anything else, told me I was playing my part correctly. When we did communicate, it was through HR, through intermediaries, through sanitized language designed to keep him at a distance from anything that could be quoted or replayed later. He had no reason to check in anymore. In his mind, the situation was stabilizing. I could almost hear the internal narrative forming. She's struggling. She's disorganized. She's buried under documentation. This is taking longer than expected. Good. At home, My days settled into a new rhythm. I woke up early, as always, made coffee, sat at the same kitchen table, but now it was covered in notes, timelines, printed logs. I worked in blocks, careful not to exhaust myself. This was not a sprint. It was a long, deliberate walk toward a destination only I could see. I started tracking not just what I knew, but what they believed I knew. There is a difference. What I knew was the shape of the impersonation, the timing of the emails, the access patterns. What they believed I knew was limited to the surface-level discrepancies, enough to protest, not enough to threaten. I preserved that illusion carefully. One afternoon, Daniel asked a question that told me everything I needed to know. "Have you considered," he said gently, "that someone may have accessed your credentials without your awareness?" I paused, just long enough to seem thoughtful. "I've considered it," I said. "But I don't know how that would have happened." He nodded, satisfied. The truth was, I knew exactly how it had happened, or at least, how it had been allowed to happen. Access like that does not come from hacking. It comes from trust, from shared systems, from permissions granted quietly, then forgotten, from someone who sits close enough to authority that their actions are assumed legitimate. In my notes, I had begun circling one role repeatedly. Not a name, a function, a position that intersected with IT, vendor management, and senior leadership. Someone who moved easily between departments, smoothing processes, helping things along. Someone whose work I had flagged more than once without realizing I was stepping on something valuable. But I did not confront that realization directly. Not yet. Instead, I focused on containment. I opened a separate checking account at a different bank, moved only what I needed to cover essentials. I froze my credit. I set up alerts on everything. The sense of control that returned was small but meaningful. I also consulted an attorney, not the kind you find in a panic, not someone who promises to fix everything quickly. I chose someone recommended quietly by a former colleague, a woman who specialized in regulatory defense and internal investigations. Our first meeting was in a nondescript office building with outdated carpet and a receptionist who did not ask unnecessary questions. I laid out my situation calmly. The audit, the impersonation, the evidence I had collected. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "You're doing the right thing by waiting," she said. I exhaled. Tension I had not fully acknowledged, loosening slightly. "They're building a story," she continued, "and they believe you're part of it, whether willingly or not. If you challenge that story too early, they'll close ranks." "What should I do?" I asked. "Exactly what you're doing," she said. "Document, preserve, stay compliant, and let them underestimate you." She paused, then added, "But when you move, you'll need to move decisively." Axers. I left her office feeling steadier than I had in weeks. That night, I sat in my living room with the lights off, the glow from my laptop reflecting faintly in the window. I reviewed my timeline again, refining it. I labeled files clearly, knowing that someday, someone else would need to follow this trail without my narration. As I worked, a thought surfaced that surprised me with its clarity. This was no longer about clearing my name. It was about choosing how much damage I was willing to absorb to expose the truth. I thought about my career, the years invested, the relationships strained, the possibility that even if I proved everything, things would never return to what they were. And I realized something else. I did not want them to. The life I had built, the one that relied so heavily on institutional trust, had shown me its limits, its fragility, its willingness to sacrifice individuals to preserve the appearance of order. Whatever came next, I did not want to step back into that same position and pretend nothing had changed. That realization hardened my resolve. I would let them continue. Let them file reports. Let them draft conclusions. Let them speak about me in rooms I was no longer allowed to enter. Because when I finally spoke, it would not be to beg for reinstatement or forgiveness. It would be to force a reckoning. And for that, I needed them comfortable, confident, certain that the woman they had sidelined was exactly where they had left her, and visible, waiting, quietly preparing to step back into the story at the only moment that would matter. Complacency has a sound. It is not loud, it does not announce itself. It settles in quietly, in the pauses between emails, in the looseness of language, in the way people stop double-checking their steps once they believe the ground beneath them is solid again. I heard it for the first time in Grant's tone. He called on a Thursday afternoon, nearly 2 months after the audit began. His name appeared on my phone without warning, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I answered. "Hey," he said, as if we were catching up after a long weekend. "Just wanted to touch base." Touch base. The phrase alone told me everything. "How are things progressing?" I asked. "Well," he said, drawing the word out, "the auditors are wrapping up preliminary findings. Nothing conclusive yet, but it's moving toward resolution." "Resolution for whom?" I wondered. "That's good to hear," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Let me know if they need anything else from me." Acted. There was a pause, followed by a faint chuckle. "I think we've got most of what we need," he said. "At this point, it's more about internal alignment." Internal alignment. I pictured conference rooms I was no longer invited into. Slides being rearranged. Language softened. Responsibility redistributed just enough to blur accountability. "Of course," I replied. After we hung up, I sat very still, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in my kitchen. The call had not been confrontational. It had not been cautious. It had been relaxed. They believed the danger had passed. That belief showed up elsewhere, too. Daniel's emails grew shorter, less frequent. He stopped asking follow-up questions about timelines and access logs. When I submitted documentation, the confirmations came quickly, almost automatically. Received. Thank you. No requests for clarification. No probing. I watched the shift with careful attention, noting each small sign. In my notes, I labeled the phase clearly. Confidence established. That was when the cracks began to widen. It started with an email I was not supposed to see. I had been included on a long thread earlier in the year, back when I still had full access. After my leave, I was removed, but automated systems have a way of remembering things long after people forget to clean them up. One afternoon, a notification slipped through. It was brief, a reply all sent too quickly, without thinking. The subject line referenced the vendor I had overseen. The body contained a single sentence. "Legal says this version should be safe if we need to justify past approvals." I stared at the words until they blurred. Safe. If we need to justify. I saved the email immediately, preserving headers and metadata before the system could retract it. Minutes later, the message disappeared from my inbox. Too late. That night, I reviewed the email chain in full, using my archived access. The language was revealing. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was casual. People spoke freely when they believed the worst was behind them. Someone referenced the compliance issue as if it were a minor obstacle, already navigated. Someone else joked about how thorough the auditors had been, followed by a laughing emoji. The conversation never mentioned my name. Not once. I was no longer a person in their story. I was a variable that had been accounted for. The next slip came from a different direction. My attorney forwarded me a public records notice she had filed quietly weeks earlier, requesting correspondence between senior management and the auditing firm. Nothing aggressive, nothing alarming. Just enough to establish a paper trail if we needed it later. "Something interesting came back," she wrote. Attached was a partial release, redacted, but not carefully enough. One email stood out. A senior executive had written, "We need to make sure the narrative stays focused on process failure, not individual intent. This protects everyone. Everyone, except me." The executive went on to suggest that isolated credential misuse could be framed as negligence rather than malice, minimizing exposure. I read the sentence several times, feeling something close to calm settle over me. Negligence. That was the word they had chosen for me. Someone careless, overwhelmed, disorganized, not malicious enough to warrant outrage, not innocent enough to demand correction. Perfect. As if on cue, the auditors scheduled a final interview. Daniel's tone was almost friendly when we spoke. "This is mostly procedural," he said. "We're just closing the loop." The call was scheduled for the following Monday. Over the weekend, I prepared carefully, not by rehearsing arguments or organizing evidence, but by reviewing my notes on them. Their language, their assumptions, the conclusions they were already leaning toward. During the call, Daniel summarized their findings. "There's no indication of intentional wrongdoing on your part," he said. However, there were lapses in credential security and oversight that allowed for irregular activity. Lapses. Allowed. Passive verbs. Carefully chosen. He went on to explain that the report would likely recommend internal controls be strengthened and roles clarified. There would be no formal accusation, but the company would need to address performance concerns related to my position. "And what does that mean for me?" I asked. He hesitated. "That would be up to the organization," he said. "But given the circumstances, it may be difficult to restore your previous responsibilities." Difficult. I thanked him for the clarification and ended the call. When I sat back, my hands were steady. They thought they had been generous. No charges, no scandal. Just a quiet, professional sidelining. A soft landing that would make resistance look unreasonable. Later that day, Grant emailed. He framed the message as supportive, almost sympathetic. "This has been a challenging process for everyone," he wrote. "We appreciate your cooperation. HR will be in touch regarding next steps." I was know that. For everyone. The phrase echoed in my mind. That evening, I went for a walk around my neighborhood, the air cool and crisp as autumn settled in. Leaves crunched under my feet. Porch lights flickered on as families settled in for the night. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. I returned home and opened my laptop, not to review evidence, but to read through my timeline one last time. Every impersonated email, every access log, every contract amendment, every careless phrase that slipped through once they stopped guarding their words. They had underestimated the power of comfort. They believed I would be relieved to escape punishment, grateful for the absence of formal blame, too exhausted to push back against a system that had already decided how this would end. They were wrong. Because while they were focused on closing the case, I was preparing to open something else entirely. Not an argument, not an appeal. A record. A clean, chronological account that showed intent without needing to shout it, that revealed coordination without speculation. That demonstrated how easily the machinery of compliance could be bent by those who knew where its blind spots were. I did not plan to hand it to the company. I planned to hand it to people who had no incentive to protect them. But first, I needed one more thing. Confirmation. I needed them to say, in their own words, what they believed had happened. And thanks to their confidence, their relief, their quiet sense of victory, they were about to give it to me, without realizing that the moment they stopped watching me closely was the moment I became most dangerous. Power, I learned, does not announce itself with authority or volume. It moves quietly, through channels most people never bother to understand because they assume someone else is watching them. I had spent my career guarding those channels for an organization that no longer wanted me. Now, I began using that knowledge for something far more precise. I did not start with the company. I started with the regulators. There is a misconception that federal and state oversight bodies move slowly, that they are buried under paperwork and indifferent to individual cases. That misconception exists because most people approach them emotionally, or too late, or without understanding how to frame what they are seeing. I did none of those things. Instead, I treated it like a technical report. I prepared a packet. Not dramatic, not accusatory, no language about betrayal or injustice. Just a structured submission outlining a potential systemic compliance vulnerability within a healthcare logistics operation. I framed it as concern, not complaint. Subject: potential credential, misuse and control gaps in third-party billing authorization. Inside, I included exactly what mattered. A timeline of impersonated actions correlated with documented meetings where I was visibly unavailable. Metadata demonstrating access patterns inconsistent with normal use. Contract amendments that bypassed required approval workflows. Internal correspondence that revealed intent to frame irregularities as process failure rather than investigate authorship. I redacted names, where appropriate. I cited regulations. I referenced reporting thresholds. I did not claim wrongdoing. I asked for guidance. That was the key. People respond differently when you ask them how to proceed instead of demanding they act. Within 48 hours, I received an acknowledgement from a state-level oversight office. Polite, non-committal. Exactly what I expected. 3 days later, a second email arrived. This one asked clarifying questions. Not about me. About the company's internal controls. About segregation of duties. About credential management practices. I answered carefully. Factually. I included additional documentation. Nothing inflammatory. Just enough to demonstrate that the issue extended beyond a single employee's oversight. While that process moved forward quietly, I turned my attention to another lever. The auditors. North Star Audit Services had conducted the external review under the assumption that their work would remain internal. But auditors are bound by professional standards that extend beyond client loyalty, especially when presented with evidence suggesting misrepresentation. I did not accuse them of misconduct. I sent a letter. Professional. Calm. I thanked them for their thorough review and asked whether their conclusions would change if presented with additional evidence indicating coordinated credential impersonation by someone with elevated access privileges. I attached nothing. I waited. 2 days later, Daniel called. His tone was different this time. Not confident, not relaxed. "Can you clarify what you mean by coordinated impersonation?" he asked. I did. Briefly. Precisely. I did not reveal my full hand. I described the pattern. The signature inconsistencies. The timing overlaps. The contract amendment that could not have occurred without administrative override. There was a long silence on the line. "That wasn't part of the initial scope," he said finally. "I understand," I replied. "But it may affect the validity of the conclusions." Another pause. "We'll need to review this," he said. After the call, I sat back and allowed myself a moment of something close to satisfaction. Not because I had won, but because the direction of scrutiny had shifted. That shift rippled outward faster than I expected. Grant emailed the following morning. His message was shorter than usual, less polished. "Let's schedule a conversation," he wrote. "I want to make sure we're aligned." Aligned. The word felt almost comical now. I agreed to a call later that week. In the meantime, I received a response from the Oversight Office requesting a formal meeting. They wanted me to walk through my documentation and explain how I believed the control failures could expose patients, not just the company, to risk. Patience. That was the word that changed everything. Compliance violations become far more interesting when they are tied to potential harm beyond balance sheets. The meeting was conducted via secure video. 3 people on the other side. All business. No small talk. They asked pointed questions, technical questions, the kind that told me they already understood more than they were letting on. When I finished, one of them nodded slowly. "This suggests an internal actor with sustained access," he said. "And motive." I did not comment. "We'll take this under advisement," another said. "You did the right thing bringing it forward." I ended the call and sat quietly, my hands resting flat on the table. This was the moment. Not a confrontation, not a dramatic reveal, a recalibration. Later that afternoon, Grant called. His voice was careful. "Too careful. I've been made aware that you've raised concerns externally," he said. I did not deny it. "I followed appropriate reporting channels," I replied. "That may complicate things," he said. "For whom?" I asked. There it was. The first crack. This situation was moving toward resolution, he said. Reopening questions now could have consequences. End quote. "I'm aware," I said. He exhaled. "What do you want?" he asked, the patience finally slipping. The question surprised me. Not because he asked it, but because he assumed the answer. "I want the truth documented accurately," I said, "and I want my name removed from actions I did not take." There was silence. Then quietly, "This doesn't have to get bigger than it already is." I smiled, though he could not see it. "It already is," I said. After we hung up, I felt a weight lift that I had been carrying for months. They were no longer controlling the pace. They were reacting. Within a week, the company announced an internal review of access controls, framed as proactive, unrelated to any specific individual. Northstar requested a follow-up interview. HR emailed to inform me that additional context had emerged. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just movement. I watched it all from a distance, detached and focused. This was the power I had not understood before. Not authority granted by a title, not leverage derived from hierarchy, but procedural inevitability. Once certain processes are triggered, they cannot be quietly undone. Reports must be updated, disclosures considered, oversight expanded. And once external eyes are involved, narratives lose their flexibility. That night, as I organized my files one final time, I realized something else. I was no longer fighting to return to my old role. I was dismantling the conditions that made what happened to me possible. Whether the company survived that intact was no longer my concern. I had learned how power actually moves, and for the first time since that conference room door had closed behind me, I was no longer standing in the wrong place. I was standing just outside the system, watching it turn on itself. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, exactly 3 months after the day the conference room door had closed behind me. This time, I was not the one being summoned. The invitation came from the State Oversight Office, sent to multiple parties at once: company counsel, senior leadership, representatives from Northstar Audit Services. A notice that the session would be recorded, minutes taken, and follow-up actions assigned. There was no mention of me in the subject line, but I was listed as a primary presenter. I arrived early. Old habits die hard. The building was a nondescript government office downtown, all neutral colors and functional furniture, no glass walls, no branding, just a reception desk, a waiting area, and a hallway that smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. As I sat down, I noticed Grant across the room. He looked tired. Not stressed in the way people get before a performance, but worn down, like someone who has been explaining the same thing too many times to audiences that were no longer nodding along. He did not meet my eyes. Neither did the senior executive seated beside him, flipping through a folder with unnecessary intensity. Northstar's representatives sat together, quieter than I had ever seen them. No one spoke. At 9 sharp, the door opened, and we were called in. The room was larger than I expected, arranged in a horseshoe, microphones at each seat, a screen at the front, a small digital clock mounted on the wall, its red numbers impossible to ignore. This was not a conversation. It was a record. The facilitator opened with formalities, outlining the purpose of the meeting and the scope of discussion. Then she turned to me. "Please proceed," she said. I stood. I did not bring emotion with me to that podium. I did not bring grievances or personal history. I brought documentation. I began with dates. Clear, sequential, boring, if you did not know what to listen for. I walked them through access logs correlated with calendar entries, showing repeated instances where actions were taken under my credentials while I was verifiably unavailable. I explained the signature anomalies in impersonated emails, displaying side-by-side comparisons that highlighted the subtle inconsistencies no one had bothered to question. I spoke about contract amendments that bypassed required approval paths, explaining why those changes mattered not just to compliance, but to patient care and reimbursement integrity. I did not name anyone. I did not accuse. I let the patterns speak. As I talked, I watched the room. The oversight officials leaned forward slightly, pens moving. Northstar's representatives exchanged glances, their earlier confidence replaced by something closer to calculation. The company's legal counsel shifted in his seat, his notes growing messier as the narrative moved away from individual negligence and toward systemic manipulation. When I finished, I sat down. The room was quiet. Then the questions began. Not for me, for them. How was credential access managed at the administrative level? What controls existed to prevent impersonation by authorized users? Why were flagged discrepancies resolved upstream without documentation? Each question landed with increasing precision, stripping away the soft language that had protected the company for months. Grant spoke when asked. His answers were careful, but less fluid than before. The executive attempted to frame decisions as efficiency-driven, necessary in a fast-moving environment. The facilitator listened, then asked a single follow-up question that changed the temperature of the room. Who had the authority to override standard approval workflows without triggering alerts? There was a pause. A long one. That was the moment I saw it happen. The realization passed across Grant's face before he could stop it. A flicker of understanding, followed immediately by something else. Fear. Because in that pause, it became clear that the answer could not be given without pointing somewhere specific. And once pointed, it could not be retracted. The oversight official did not rush them. She waited. Finally, the executive spoke. Certain roles have elevated access, he said, for operational continuity. And are those roles audited independently? She asked. Another pause. Not routinely, he admitted. The facilitator nodded and made a note. That note, small as it was, felt heavier than anything else that had happened. The rest of the meeting unfolded in the same way, question by question, answer by answer, each response narrowing the space where plausible deniability could live. By the time it ended, the narrative had shifted completely. This was no longer about a single compliance manager who had failed to secure her credentials. It was about a structure that allowed impersonation to occur unchecked. It was about incentives misaligned with oversight. It was about decisions made quietly, justified after the fact, and hidden behind the reputation of someone who had been trained to keep things clean. I did not smile. I did not feel triumphant. What I felt was relief. Not the emotional kind, but the intellectual kind. The relief that comes when something false finally collapses under its own weight. As we stood to leave, Grant approached me for the first time since this began. This went further than it needed to, he said quietly. I looked at him. It went exactly as far as it had to, I replied. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to negotiate. In the days that followed, the consequences moved quickly. North Star issued an amended report, noting that their initial conclusions had been based on incomplete representations. The company announced an internal review led by an external firm, this time with direct regulatory oversight. Several senior roles were placed under investigation. My name was formally cleared in writing. The document arrived by email, unsigned but official. It stated that I had not engaged in intentional or negligent misconduct and that prior findings suggesting otherwise were rescinded. I read it once, then I closed it, because by then, something else had become clear. Clearing my name was not the victory. The real shift had happened in that room, when the story stopped belonging to them. When facts, presented without emotion or spectacle, forced an institution to confront the difference between convenience and truth. That afternoon, I took a long walk through the city, past buildings I used to enter every day without thinking. The air felt lighter. Or maybe I was. My phone buzzed with a message from HR, asking to discuss reinstatement options. It's something the proceeded. I did not respond right away. For the first time since this began, I had space to choose. And standing there, watching people hurry past with lives untouched by compliance failures and internal politics, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had not fought this hard to step back into the same silence. Whatever came next would not be about restoring what had been taken. It would be about deciding what I was willing to walk away from. On my own terms. The email from HR sat unread in my inbox for 2 days. Not because I was afraid of it, not because I needed time to calm down, but because for the first time in months, no one else was setting my timeline. The urgency that had driven every decision since that Tuesday morning was gone, replaced by a quiet, unfamiliar space where I was allowed to think without reacting. When I finally opened the message, it said exactly what I expected. They thanked me for my professionalism. They acknowledged the findings. They emphasized that the company valued my contributions and wanted to discuss a path forward. Reinstatement, a potential role adjustment, safeguards, assurances. It was written carefully, with the kind of language designed to sound conciliatory without admitting fault. There was no apology, no recognition of the personal cost, just an offer to return to the table, as if the table itself had not been the problem. I closed the email and stared at the wall across from my desk. For years, my identity had been wrapped around competence, around being the person who fixed things quietly, who absorbed complexity so others did not have to. Walking away from that role felt, on the surface, like waste, like letting them win something after all. But the longer I sat with the idea of going back, the clearer it became that reinstatement was not a reward. It was an attempt to restore balance without changing the structure that had nearly crushed me. The company needed me more now than it had before, not just for my expertise, but for what my presence would signal. Stability, resolution, closure. If I returned, the story would end neatly. An unfortunate misunderstanding. Lessons learned. Processes improved. Everyone could move on. Except me. I met with my attorney the following morning. She listened as I read the email aloud, my voice steady. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "They want to close the loop," she said. "Yes," I replied, "at my expense." She leaned forward slightly. "Legally," she said, "you're in a strong position. If you return and something similar happens again, the company's exposure increases significantly. That's part of why they want you back." "To protect themselves," I said. She did not argue. "What do you want?" she asked. The question landed differently this time. In the early days of the audit, what I wanted had been simple: to clear my name, to stop the bleeding, to survive. Now, those things were already done. "I want my life back," I said slowly. "Not the one I had. A different one." She smiled, just a little. "Then you already know your answer," she said. That afternoon, I called my sister. She had followed the situation from a distance, careful not to overwhelm me with concern. When I told her about the reinstatement offer, she laughed softly. "Of course they want you back," she said. "You held the whole thing together." "I don't want to hold it together anymore," I replied. There was a pause. "Good," she said. "You shouldn't." That night, I sat alone in my living room, the same space where I had spread out evidence and timelines for months. The room looked different now. Lighter, less like a command center, more like a place someone actually lived. I thought about the woman I had been before this started. The one who believed that if she followed the rules closely enough, nothing truly bad could happen. The one who mistook institutional approval for safety. I did not feel ashamed of her, but I did not want to be her again. The next morning, I drafted my response to HR. It was brief. I thanked them for the offer. I acknowledged the findings. I stated clearly that I would not be returning to my previous role or any alternative position within the organization. I cited personal reasons: a desire to pursue other opportunities, a need for distance. I did not mention betrayal, or fear, or anger. I ended the email with a single sentence: "I wish the company success as it continues to address the systemic issues identified in the review." When I sent it, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not triumph. Alignment. The reply came within an hour. They expressed disappointment, asked if I would reconsider, suggested a meeting. I declined. Over the next few weeks, the consequences of my decision unfolded quietly. Grant resigned. The company announced leadership changes. Public statements about transparency and reform circulated through industry newsletters. People who had avoided my calls months earlier reached out with tentative messages of congratulations, curiosity, admiration. I responded politely. Briefly, I did not explain myself. Instead, I focused on what came next. I took a short-term consulting role with a nonprofit focused on healthcare access. The work was different, less polished, more human. I advised on compliance frameworks that prioritized patient impact over speed and profit. No one there asked about my old title. No one cared about my reputation in corporate circles. They cared whether I could help them avoid the kind of blind spots that had nearly destroyed me. I could. On a crisp morning in early spring, I packed up the last of my old work materials. Not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed them. The binders, the color-coded tabs, the laminated guides I had once treated like armor. I donated what I could, shredded the rest. As I carried the boxes out to my car, I realized something that surprised me. I was not angry anymore. Anger had fueled the early stages, sharpened my focus, kept me moving when everything felt unstable. But now, it had burned itself out, leaving behind something cleaner: clarity. They had expected me to fight for my place back inside the system. They had expected gratitude for being spared worse consequences. They had expected me to accept reinstatement as justice. What they had not expected was for me to walk away willingly, taking with me the one thing they could not replace: my consent. In the end, that was the real twist. I did not win by reclaiming what was taken. I won by refusing to let the system that failed me define the terms of my future. And in doing so, I left them with a version of the story they could not edit. One where the person they tried to silence chose to step out of frame entirely. Not defeated, not vindicated, just free. 6 months after I walked away, I stopped introducing myself by what I used to do. It happened without ceremony, the way most real changes do. I was standing in line at a small coffee shop near the river, the kind of place where the barista knows the regulars by name and no one rushes you out the door. A woman behind me asked what I did for work. I opened my mouth, ready to deliver the familiar explanation, then closed it again. I work with organizations that don't want to hurt people by accident, I said instead. She nodded, satisfied, and that was the end of it. No follow-up questions, no curiosity about titles or employers, just an exchange that felt honest in a way I had not experienced in years. My days looked different now. I still woke up early, but not with the tight urgency that used to pull me out of sleep. Mornings were quieter. I drank my coffee slowly, often by the window, watching the city wake up without needing to be part of its machinery. Some days I worked from home. Others, I met with small teams in borrowed conference rooms or community centers that smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old carpet. The work was imperfect, underfunded, occasionally frustrating, but no one asked me to soften language to protect optics. No one redirected concerns upstream until they disappeared. When something felt wrong, we said so out loud. It was exhausting, in a different way, and it was clean. Every now and then, news from my old world drifted in. Industry updates, leadership reshuffles, quiet settlements framed as strategic realignments. People I used to know moved on to new roles, their online profiles carefully refreshed to reflect growth rather than fallout. I watched it all with a kind of distant neutrality. The system had not collapsed. It never does. It absorbs pressure, sheds expendable parts, and keeps going. For a while, I resented that. I wanted consequences to look dramatic, visible, proportional. But time has a way of reframing what justice actually looks like. Justice, I learned, is not always about watching something burn. Sometimes it is about refusing to rebuild the same structure again. One afternoon, I received an email from a junior analyst I had mentored years earlier. We had not spoken since my leave began. Her message was careful, respectful. "I don't know if you remember me," she wrote, "but I wanted to say thank you. I left the company last month. Watching what happened to you made me realize I didn't want to spend my career being quiet when something felt wrong." I stared at the screen for a long time. That email did more for me than any formal apology ever could have. At home, my space changed along with me. The dining table was no longer covered in evidence and timelines. The folders were gone. In their place were books I had meant to read for years, plants I had somehow kept alive, a sense that the house belonged to me rather than the crisis that once lived there. Some nights, I still thought about that conference room. The way the door closed, the sound of the latch, the moment I realized the rules I trusted could be turned against me. Those memories did not haunt me anymore. They informed me. They reminded me of the cost of silence, of the danger of mistaking procedure for protection, of how easily good intentions can be weaponized by people who understand systems better than ethics. I did not regret how hard I had fought, but I was grateful I did not mistake that fight for the destination. One evening, as spring tipped toward summer, I walked along the river path near my house. The water moved steadily beside me, unconcerned with institutions or reputations. People passed in both directions, each carrying a life I would never fully know. I stopped on a small bridge and leaned against the railing, watching the current. For a long time, I had believed that stability came from staying within the lines, from being indispensable, from earning a place no one would dare take away. Now, I understood something simpler and far more durable. Stability comes from knowing exactly how much of yourself you are willing to give to a system that would not hesitate to move on without you, and choosing, deliberately, not to give more than that. I thought about the version of myself who had signed her name on that Tuesday morning, believing that doing the right thing would protect her. I felt tenderness toward her now. She had done the best she could with the information she had. She had not been foolish. She had been unprepared for the kind of betrayal that wears a professional face. If I could speak to her, I would not warn her to be less trusting. I would not tell her to harden herself against the world. I would tell her this instead. Pay attention to the small things, the extra space in a signature, the questions no one answers directly, the moments when silence feels encouraged. And remember that no job, no institution, no carefully constructed role is worth losing your ability to recognize yourself. The life I live now is not louder than the one I left behind. It does not look more impressive on paper. It does not come with a badge or a title or a sense of being indispensable, but it is mine. It does not ask me to shrink, to soften, or to carry blame that does not belong to me. And when something feels wrong, I do not wait for permission to say so. That, in the end, is the quiet victory I never knew to aim for. Not redemption, not revenge. Just the freedom to step out of a story that no longer serves me and to write the next one without asking anyone else how it should end.